Hello! For my professional development workshops, I chose to focus on vocabulary building. I'll start with my literature review. I actually started with our own textbook, which talked about how there are two methods to build vocabulary. The first is direct instruction, and one of those strategies is the vocabulary self-collection strategy, where kids pick books from their own resources. And then the second strategy is just through reading, and it says picking up those words incidentally. The next source that I looked at talked a little bit more about that direct instruction and how you can help build word consciousness, which is where kids just notice words and become excited about learning and kind of look out for building their own vocabulary. I also referenced a book called The 50 Strategies for Teaching English Language Learners, and there was a good suggestion in that book about building vocabulary through role play. So what can happen is words can be introduced and it says sorted into parts of speech, and then kids can work together to create a skit and then practice that skit, and in this way they interact with words again and again and have that repeated exposure. I also referenced a book by Thomas G. Gunning called Assessing and Correcting Reading and Writing Difficulties, and this book was helpful because it first looked at kind of the more fundamental elements, that make up words, like the syllable elements, the morpheme elements, how you can determine a word contextually, and dictionary skills. I was most interested in the morpheme side of things, those units of meaning within words. And this book talked about how teachers can help kids notice prefixes, suffixes, roots, and even use a word wall to help kids reference them. Also within this book, it talked about making goals for vocabulary learning and using strategies like graphic organizers. Again, that vocabulary self-collection strategy was mentioned. Then I moved on to my actual workshops, and I was envisioning a series of 5 30-minute workshops. It could be longer, but hopefully something that was brief so that it wouldn't take up too much teacher time. And in that first session, I would want to focus on the VSS. And before the workshop would even begin, I'd ask teachers to bring in some items of interest, like books or magazines or anything that they wanted, to kind of model how important it is for the students to have choice in their learning. And when they came in, I would talk about how this strategy helps build that word consciousness I referenced earlier. I would then have the teachers explore the items of text that they brought in and look for 3 or so words that stood out to them. When working with younger students, I would encourage words that maybe they did not know, but of course with teachers that their knowledge would probably be greater. So any words of interest, and then using a smartphone or computer, writing down just a brief definition. The next step that Gunning had recommended was taking those words and sharing everyone's, but bringing that down to a list of 10. And then activities and learning can be centered around that list. But the powerful element is that students would have chosen the vocabulary they were going to learn. So the next step could be researching the definitions, the parts of speech, using those vocabulary words in different activities or writing, and in that way the words can be evaluated, or even at the end of the week a vocabulary test or a spelling test could be used to assess student learning. I wrote a note on here that the words that were not chosen from that list of 10 could also be used in the other strategies. So as the workshop presenter, that would be something to keep in mind. Moving on to the next session, I would focus on that morphology and etymology. And those were the two things that I had referenced from the gunning text. And before the workshop would begin, again, the presenter would need to have a list of words to focus the learning on. And I would start perhaps by writing a very complex word, like this word that I have here, hemosidometer. This was an example given by Gunning, where you could have people use background knowledge to think about if they have any connections or can think about any parts of the word they may know. And then after the classes had a chance to talk and think, the presenter, or me in this case, could show that I can divide this big word into parts of meaning, hem meaning blood, site meaning cell, meter meaning measure, and together I can determine that hemosidometer means a device that measures blood cells. And so that's a good example of how the parts of words, the prefix, the root, the suffix, can help determine meaning. And within a classroom, I would explain how knowing that information is useful, and then I might have kids study each of these elements throughout the school year. We might spend time on certain prefixes one week, or suffixes the next, or maybe a mix. My suggestion was to write down those word or those units of meaning, those morphemes, on sentence strips, possibly even having a picture on that front of the card to help jog one's memories, and on the back having the definition, then taking those sentence strips and putting in a pocket chart or on a word wall so kids could reference, and it could help them when they reach words they do not know. This could be evaluated in the same way with writing. It could be in a spelling test, or even a prefix-suffix roots test. So that's something to consider. In the next session, I would talk about graphic organizers, and I could start by just modeling the technique by, for example, writing the word ocean on the board, having the people in the class think about any associations with that word, and then showing how one could map those connections out on like a concept map. And I could explain that having a concept map can help kids or anyone visually develop meaning around a word by almost placing it within the context. And I could extend that lesson by talking about all the other different types of graphic organizers, like flowcharts or a Venn diagram or KWL, and know or want to know or learn. And then in the same way that all the other vocabulary strategies can be assessed, any words learned with graphic organizers can be assessed the same way, or at the end of a unit of study, students could plug in their vocabulary words into their own graphic organizer. The second to last session, I would talk about the role play that was mentioned in the 50 strategies for English language learners. And I might start this lesson by modeling the technique, performing my own one-man show that includes 10 vocabulary words, and then talking with the attendees about how they had to use context to determine the meaning of the words that I used in my skit, then allowing them to practice themselves and explain how when kids do this, they are allowed to have some student choice in the activity, and they have to practice their lines so they have repeated exposure to the words. And to extend this activity, cross-sims could created backdrops, and then in the same way a test or some type of assessment at the end of the week using those words, or even I suggested if you had multiple skits, students might, depending on their grade level, take notes on the words they learn in other people's skits, and then those words can be tested. The last and most important strategy, in my opinion, is the read, read, read. And I would start this workshop by, before it even began, I would invite people to bring all different types of text, and then model 5 minutes of SSR, where I just have everyone silently reading. And I could model that process, or I could conduct reading conferences. And then when we were done with that time, I would explain that the most powerful method in vocabulary building is just by reading and picking up words throughout that process. And so we need to encourage kids to read a lot to help build that vocabulary. This can be extended by having the people at the workshop share a little bit about the books they're reading and just get each other excited about the different texts in the room. And again, modeling how an excitement about reading helps kids read and then build their vocabulary in turn. Also, another way to evaluate that kids are reading and thinking about words and kind of actively engaging in that word consciousness is by having a reading journal. And so a teacher could evaluate that reading time by checking journals at the end of the time and seeing if kids wrote down words that they were interested in and helping students with their own accountability. At the end of that session, I would have a workshop evaluation form that I would pass out, and I would allow the name to be optional. And then it would just be a simple rating system. I find that though these evaluations are always handy, at the end of a workshop I'm ready to go, and so I tried to make it easy and quick for attendees. So I would want them to kind of rank each strategy and then provide comments or ask questions about them if they had any. And then apart from the strategies, I would also inquire if to the length of the workshops and if the classroom environment was enjoyable, if the room was cold, or whatever it may be. And then if the way that I presented was enjoyable, and then I could take that information and improve upon the next workshop series. And beyond that, I have my references listed, but I hope that this presentation was a little bit helpful in your own vocabulary building strategies. Thank you.